Good day, all. Welcome back for another episode in our series on the practices of discipleship. In our series, we'll continue to look at various different discipleship practices that the Kingdom Story feels are foundational and important for someone following Jesus. Joining me today, as always, for the conversation is John Lewis and a dear friend of ours, Bob Mumford. John, why don't you take a second and introduce Bob and your connection with him and to leadership?
Well, Bob, thank you, Brandon. Bob and I first met when we were working together for the CIA. Wait a minute, we weren't working for the CIA. That was somebody else. No,
That was
Bob
the
and I.
dream you were in. Yeah.
Bob and I met at a wedding actually about 30 years ago, and became. Our wives were already dear friends from college, and we became immediately friends at the wedding reception table and the dance floor. I really love Bob's moves out there, and that I just drew me into him. And so, but Bob, we were young life leaders at the time, I think, Bob. So, I mean, we were both involved in young life, and then staying in relationship with Bob over the years. He's, been a business guy, and he's been involved, in his church. He's been involved with friends in politics. Bob is someone who loves to come alongside leaders and to be influenced by leaders and to be a leader. And so we've had conversations of his ups and downs over the years. I'm just thrilled that Bob would join us to share a little bit of his story and insights about not only leadership in his own journey, but just kind of what's going on in the world today. I think we'll be blessed. So Bob, welcome, Kingdom Story, welcome, and we're glad you're with us.
Well, thank you, John and Brandon. Nice to be with you guys. It's actually interesting when you asked me about to jump on leadership, because one of my big observations in my life really over the last period of time has been in my own identity, really understanding my role with leadership, which for so long I was told that, you're going to be this great leader and up front and in front of people, and realizing that I can do that, but I'm far better and far more equipped to come alongside leaders. To make them, honestly, what the Lord's really showed me is help them keep their eyes on the Father, on Jesus, and not get caught into the fray of the war going on down low. Behold, keep your eyes up. And so anyway, we can go into more detail of that.
Well, and that's been a real calling as we've journeyed together, Bob, for you to discover that. And so that has just put you in a place of thinking about leadership, supporting leadership, and knowing a lot of leaders. And so we're really glad for your perspective today. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob, for joining us. It's a privilege to have you with us today. Well, as Bob kind of hinted to, today we're going to talk about the practice of leadership. And I know this term is used in multiple different spheres, and many of us have our own assumptions and definitions, and even people who exemplify or define what leadership is. And we aren't going to try and tackle all of that in this episode.
Heck no.
Here for like weeks. And so it's good to remember that Kingdom Story, we focus on building the foundations of discipleship. And so we specialize in the 101. And so there are numerous resources on leadership and how to become a better leader in your sphere of influence. But we're going to focus on the foundations of leadership and looking at it from a biblical perspective. And so with that lead in a little bit, John, can you help us understand what Kingdom Story means when we talk about leadership from a fundamental perspective?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brandon. I think in particular, I'm going to draw my examples today, and both Bob and I will all jump in and looking at the example of Nehemiah and the Kingdom Story lesson on Nehemiah, and looking at a couple excerpts from the beginning of his work and helping rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Kind of teases out some of those fundamental practices of leadership. And of course, the whole book of Nehemiah has been done extensive sermon series and books and curriculums on all the aspects. And we hope someday to be able to do that in Kingdom Story. We would love to do that kind of a curriculum too, but we're just zeroing in on a few. And one of the things that Nehemiah exemplifies in terms of a definition of leadership, Brandon, is that leaders move people to a place they wouldn't naturally go. That's what, so there was a group of people that were discouraged and overwhelmed and hopeless. They wanted, at one level, they wanted the walls rebuilt, but they wouldn't naturally go there. They didn't feel empowered. And so Nehemiah, in what he does, he helps move a group of people to a place that they wouldn't naturally go. And so I think when you think about leadership like that, then you realize that there are different kinds of leadership. In Bob's words, there's different ways of leading. We all have different styles. How do we contribute to that? So parents do that, coaches do that, teachers do that, neighbors do that. Whether you have a title or not, we are made in God's image, who is a leader, to help people move to a place they may not naturally go. Some of them, people will have big titles like government officials, and we think, oh, those are the real leaders. No, no, no. In God's economy, there are different levels of leadership. There are different roles. There are different titles. But all of us are called to be involved in God's work and moving people forward to a place they might not naturally go.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And I mean, you mentioned and you hinted at it that lots of leadership books have been written about Nehemiah, and there are many aspects of leadership today. And as we begin to unpack leadership, I think we've chosen a few aspects that we wanted to focus on today that really kind of hit at the heart for us. If we just had to obviously do a podcast on it, that we talk about and bring Bob in. And so, John, how about you introduce us to some of those aspects and how we got them out of the scriptures, and your just thoughts on them.
You bet. When we had our Kingdom Story Bible study, focuses, like I said, on these first 3 or 4 vignettes in the first 4 chapters or so, to just give people a taste of his initial leadership. And here's what we came up with, and this is what Bob and I interacted with. What are we going to focus on? But very quickly, that Nehemiah's leadership started before he did anything. He was brokenhearted by the news. He had a burden, again, for where something could go and should go and wasn't going, and it broke his heart. And he connected to God. Here we're talking about Christian leadership now, that it didn't just start within himself. He brought it before God, and he prayed before God, and he was moved by God. Secondly, beyond the prayer and compassion, was that he began his journey in Jerusalem, not by bringing the plan, but by finding someone, that would lend him a horse, and a group of people that would do an on-site survey. And I can just imagine him asking questions, finding out what happened. Why is this stuck? Why is it not being rebuilt? He listened before he did anything. Thirdly, in chapter, the next thing he does is he begins to gather the leaders together out of the dust, so to speak, and say, listen, we can come, let us. It's the we language. Clearly, people had a sense that he was building a team. He wasn't just doing it alone. And then the next chapter, he delegates it. He's serious about this team thing. He gives away ownership. Everybody works outside their piece of property, and their home, and everybody's involved. He lets go of power, and it's built in 52 days. And then lastly, as he does that, all good leadership, and again, these are characteristics of all good leadership today as well, is that good leadership promotes opposition. There are going to be people who don't like what you're doing. As soon as you put your colors out there, as soon as you move forward, people who benefited from the status quo are going to say, whoa. And so Sanballat and Tobiah start taunting, start double down on keeping him from moving forward and them from moving forward. And what he does for himself before God in prayer, taking the sword in one hand, he was committed to overcoming the opposition. So those are the 5 aspects of leadership that we saw in Nehemiah that are true today. And as Bob and I chatted, we decided we're going to zoom in on a couple of them only, just for time. But the first question, Bob, I wanted to ask before we get started for us, Brandon and I, as well as our listeners, is just for you to say a little bit about your experience of leadership over the decades. I can say that now, Bob, over the decades.
Oh,
I know it's hard, but over the decades, and maybe give us a picture of how and why leadership has come to matter so much to you.
Well, first of all, let me say, John, the big takeaway for me is that it's said, or the name is pronounced Sanballat versus Sanballat, which I've been saying all along. So I am a blessed man from this conversation. Leadership, it's interesting because, I was a student body president at Oregon State when I was 22, 23 years old, and back in the 80s. And for some reason, when that occurred, all these people started coming around, including my dad and my other leaders in the state, that assumed because of this title, which is, I mean, that's a whole nother story, but, this title made it like I'm assumed to be a leader because of this title that I've been given through some election of a bunch of 20-year-olds, and what maybe 10% of the campus votes, and half of them are from my fraternity, right? So it's and yet all of a sudden this thought that I'm a leader gets given to me, and a close friend of mine happened at that time to go back to Washington, D.C. to the National Prayer Breakfast. And he came back floored by the model of Jesus as the servant leader. And so we kind of began investigating that. And it, of course, flies in the face of everything that I'd been told about leadership. Leadership is control. Leadership is, making decisions. That is, those were the signs of a good leader. Somebody with a strong personality that
Right.
kind of, will frustrate people, but man, he's going to make decisions. In the business world, the way I've heard it put is, the person who makes 9 decisions, the leader that makes 9 decisions out of 10 correctly, will never be as successful as the guy that made 51 decisions out of 100. So he had a 51% success rate on the decisions, and yet he or she failed on 49%, but the more decisions made, the better. There's a few problems with that. But that's what I was taught. And then, but then my world kind of got rocked in 2016. I thought I was being groomed to be president of a company, as John is very familiar with, and I got let go. I prefer a nicer way to say it, as I was canned, kicked to the curb, something like that. And by my company, I was shocked. Yet that opened a door where a close friend of mine who's involved in the political world in Salem, he was the minority leader for the legislature in Oregon at the time, called me and goes, "Hey, I'm sorry you got your butt handed to you, but hey, what I'd love, why don't you come down and be my little buddy here while I'm in this role as a minority leader?" And when I say minority leader, I mean the Republican Party in Oregon. And I said, "Boy, that sounds super attractive. You mean I get to come down for free and hang out with a bunch of politicians? Wow. Does that
And not make 51 decisions, Bob.
and not make yes. Basically carry your bag from meeting to meeting." And I stayed away from that thought and wasn't doing it. Fast forward 6 months later, I'm back at the National Prayer Breakfast thinking I was going to see the first woman president at the time. And instead it was not. It was a businessman from New York who was the president. And it was very controversial, and the prayer breakfast didn't go great. And it was the time I've probably heard the Father speak to me more clearly than ever before throughout that whole week. And the clear message was, get your butt to Salem to be with Mike. And so I called him, and the following Wednesday, I'm in Salem, my little sport coat and little tie, being his little buddy. And I'm watching this political leadership role play out in a way where we realize some things about political leaders. For example, a lot of times a business guy like me, who's used to making decisions, business guys and gals tend to be really focused on how do we get to a decision, versus academics and lawyers, their tendency is to really make sure the process and the thinking is clear, and that creates tension. So my friend kept teaching me he'd always have to bring in new politicians who get elected like me. We'd come in and we're ready to, make decisions right now. And we run into this wall called democracy. Thank goodness, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And the lawyers, like my friend, have to teach us how to think. We have to win people to our thinking. So, and I'm sure, John, you can make the connection to where I'm going there with
Yeah.
Nehemiah.
Sure.
He saw the walls broken down, and instead of just jumping in with his tools, I mean, he inspected, he talked to the people, and then he won their trust. And it played out even further as you got into chapter 3 and 4 in Nehemiah, where the opposition started coming. So anyway, I think I'll let you ask questions from there, but just to give you a sense of how leadership's played out.
That's great. Super helpful. And thank you, Bob. And what I think we decided we wanted to do was to take a couple of these characteristics that we found not only are things that you're passionate about, but also seem really relevant on both the larger leadership scene, but also very much in our own lives and our own roles. And so the first one we thought we'd lean into is this listening to the people before going forward. I have a quick example of working with Dave Hillis and the Leadership Foundations in years past. And he said if he had a dime for every time somebody came into the city and said, we've got a great idea to save the city, he said if he could retire early. And so there is this tendency, whether it's parenting or city initiatives or leadership in general, is to not listen first. And in today's world, where it seems like so few people, Bob and Brandon, are really listening, we're losing the art of listening. Let's just double down and say, why is it so fundamental as a practice for leaders to listen? And tell us a little bit about how you would explore that for a few minutes.
Well, so currently I work for a nonprofit called National Christian Foundation Northwest, which is, and we work with people typically with some wealth that are believers that are looking for how they can exercise their generosity tax efficiently. And we have a leader in Seattle that I work for, and she has been the best model I've had of listening, in the sense that it's not only a practice of hers, but it's almost expected, demanded of us that our full voices will be at the table. And without that, you get the muted voice, you get the agenda voice, you get the voice, I sure want to keep my job voice. Versus creating an environment, which she has done really well, where it's like, she will not stop pressing in to get our input of what we really think about the direction we're going, or whether we should pursue a particular line of charitable giving that we're involved with. And it's very interesting for me, because I really realize she's helped me realize, boy, I really have to do that in my own family. So for example, I'm an extrovert. I'm a pretty strong personality. And so my wife is introvert. If anybody out there's Enneagram-ish, she's a 5. So she's analyzing everything and harder to make decisions. And I will have the natural tendency to just overrun her, and she will not have her full voice at the table. And I have to work to expect, to raise the expectation that your full voice is at the table. And by the way, and John, you know my wife fairly well, it is not husband PR work. It is, she's just stinking smart. I mean, we as a family, the world needs her voice. And as a leader, I get to help her bring that voice out, just like my boss, Kendra, does for me in Seattle. She challenges me to get beyond my insecurities, to use my full voice and really press into what is it that in my heart I think we really need to do. And honestly, that's what I see Nehemiah doing really well. Because by the time it was time to start building the wall, they had felt so heard. Their voices were part of the story of why we need to rebuild this thing. That now all of a sudden, when opposition comes, I'm all in. I'm ready because I've been part of it. It hasn't just been told to me.
And what I like about that, Bob, is when you think about Nehemiah, is that did he listen because, like, I'm supposed to do this before I'm going to do what I'm going to do anyway? Or did he actually, like Kendra, fundamentally believe that without their voice and out their wisdom, that their strategy going forward would be incomplete? And I think that's part of this listing. What you're reminding me of is it comes deep from inside of us. It's not something we put we paint on the outside, but it's a deep humility that recognizes the need for the other, and that we don't automatically listen and we don't automatically speak what needs to be heard. I love that emphasis on bringing the full voice.
You know, I made a decision this week. I felt like in my prayer time and journaling that, and some books I've been reading, I felt like I was supposed to cut off all news sources, like all of them. And everything in me wanted to just make that decision on my own, but I felt like I knew, and it really ties, John, to what you're saying. It's like, I want community around me to make sure it's not the pizza I ate last night. It's actually the Father communicating to me. And so I went to my community, Beth, my wife, which of course she's totally honored that I consider her I go to her as community, not just my brothers, which I often forget to do. And she really confirmed that. And there's something about that, being in it together, making those decisions that we need each other. So to your point, the voices on the wall were not, the way I see it, he did not have an agenda already in place. And that's honestly what I see quite a bit in the political arena. It's like, okay, I'm gonna do my part to just appear like I'm really caring and listening, but I've really got this agenda.
Yeah.
And so we're really not going into the space, when you watch stuff on the Senate floor or the Congress's floor, and it's fascinating to me to watch because people are making speeches and people are having full conversations on the phone.
Exactly.
And when I was in Salem, I was watching my buddy, and he'd be up there giving these, there's 5 minute, I think it's 10-minute limits on your statements, unless another person in the body gives you their time. And so he would get up and speak for 10 minutes and he'd be on a roll, and then his 10 minutes would come up and there's a little timer, and then another person, of course, in his party would raise their hand and give him his time. So there'd be another 5 minutes, and he'd go on for 25 minutes, and people are having full meetings on the floor. And I'm sitting there my role is to sit on the side and be praying over this whole body, and not just him, but people on the other side and all that. And it was fascinating to see how little listening. It was really more getting something on record for people to refer to than it was about really negotiating thoughts.
So it's interesting, Bob, that's like a Senate culture, right? I mean, this is just the way they do things now. And it would be interesting just to ask you what leads us to have, whether it's the Senate floor or the Facebook culture, or a family that no longer listens to each other, mom and dad, blah, 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 kids don't listen. I mean, I'm just wondering if you could reflect a moment is what is inside of us as leaders, that makes what makes it hard? What gets in the way of being a person who truly listens? Is it ego, do you think? Is it our own insecurity? Is it our lack of identity? You mentioned about really wrestling with your identity at the beginning of this podcast. It's one thing, I can't just turn on a switch and be a good listener. What is the internal and maybe external obstacles you see that keeps leaders from listening, that's starting with listening?
Well, I do think I think the core of it is identity issues. And when I say identity, what I mean is I identify as part of a team. And in my insecurity, that makes me feel more secure because I am part of a team. And if you threaten my team, then my walls go up. I no longer listen to you. You are the enemy. Um, and honestly, on the far extremes of it, I need to destroy you because you are the enemy. And what I've been fascinated with is in my own life. I mean, I can critique public figures all day long on how team oriented they are. I just have to look we're on face or Zoom right now, and I'm looking at myself and I'm like, I can just spend plenty of time wrestling with my own face in the mirror on how team oriented I get.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Mumford team, it's the political party team, it's I mean, I remember you've been in it, Young Life versus other youth ministries. Are you kidding me? You're kidding me. And I was more guilty than anybody. It's like the arrogance I would show as a Young Life leader. Like, we've got youth ministry dialed, and it's like, there was a team mindset. It was my insecurity that would drive me to get into a team that made me feel more secure and therefore secured that my identity, my value is solidified. Versus if I'm going to be a listening leader, all of a sudden I'm going to truly listen. Oh man, I'm opening myself up to changing, being viewed as inconsistent, being viewed as wishy-washy. I think that's what drives a lot of political leaders in particular, more than business leaders. Business leaders, I think, they're willing to listen if it's going to help them achieve better results. But politically, man, you are facing you either look weak or you look indecisive. And that's a very courageous place to go.
Yeah.
To true listener.
When you think about how, in some ways, the whole Facebook or just the world of social media that's drawn out some of this, speaking without listening culture, it's pervasive. And I wonder if, as we think about this as Jesus followers, if there is an aspect of when we listen to the Father first, that baptism voice that says, "You are my beloved child, with you I am well pleased." When we are rooted in an identity that goes beyond people's reactions or approval, we can come to listen in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. And I'm going to have to change the gears and to the second point here, Bob, about building a team, because you've mentioned here team as a potentially a thing that would move us away from listening if the team is wrongly seen as my tribe that I cannot deviate from, and I've already been given a script, right? Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about leadership that builds a kind of team that, by the way, would be able to listen, and would be able to get things done in a way that builds ownership. So talk a little bit about the importance and building a team, and what would that team look like so that it could empower and listen and be fruitful.
When I went to Salem, it was really interesting to watch Mike invite me in to meetings, and I'm the guy in the room that everybody looks at and goes, why is this guy in the room? I'm not sure what he's doing. And I had to get secure with that, right? That I am not, my identity isn't to be the cool guy here. It was super freeing, by the way. Incredible experience for me. But then for Mike, we would constantly come out of the meetings and he is asking me, dude, was I too harsh? Was I too strong? What did you think? Did I use my voice? He was submitting to the team. He was inviting me into his team to help him. So when I talk about teams, I'm talking about more out of my insecurity. I'm going to isolate in my group to be opposite of another group. So it'd be like Christians versus Muslims, and the classic missionary problem of where we've been trying to get somebody from a completely different culture to get like us, and then we'll go pursue the kingdom of God. It's like, whoa, wait, no. I want to journey towards the kingdom of God with you, brother, sister. Whatever your culture is irrelevant. It's the kingdom of God is, and Jesus is that doorway to that kingdom. And I want to go through that with you where you're at, not try to get you like me. Gosh, Lord, no, I don't want you to get like me. We don't need more of me.
Right. So diversity no longer becomes a threat.
Right.
It actually becomes the actual what's needed to build a team. And you can imagine a football team if everybody was the quarterback, or you got Paul's image if everybody was the hand. You need the diversity is essential to the team.
So building the team, I think at Nehemiah, I mean, he won their hearts, right? I mean, they were with him, and then he was willing to trust them in delegation, right? You are part of this, and I'm giving you ownership. On our team with NCF, I feel like I've been given authority over a certain area of the Northwest to care for givers and advisors, and but I have a covering, right? I mean, this is beautiful leadership, right? She's covering me. I don't feel alone. But we're a part of a team. So she's building this team that's unified, that has our full voice at the table. What's interesting, John, when you bring it up, is I've been trying to build my team down here in Oregon for the last year and a half, and I've gone through 6 candidates, and it's been one of those situations for me trying to build a team where I refuse to just get a body on the team. Right. Where in my business environment, a lot of times we just were so desperate to get somebody, we would just grab anybody that could walk and talk. We were bringing them on, and it's like, and I've just experienced it enough where that just fails all the time. We need to I want to discern who is going to be a great fit where we are a complete blessing to them, their life and their journey, and vice versa. For not just me, but for the organization, that we're going to be better because this person's story is merging in with ours. And that's what I feel like Nehemiah does really well, because they see themselves part of something way bigger than just the task and their own compensation or whatever.
It's good. Well, and I think, when we dip back even to the wider view of the scripture, Bob, as you're sharing about Nehemiah and your own story, I'm thinking of God creating in his image Adam and Eve together would cultivate the garden. It wasn't just Moses, it was Moses and Aaron. It wasn't just David, it was his crucial friend Jonathan that partnered with him, and his mighty men. And by the way, Jesus and his disciples, I mean, the very first move he makes is to build a team. And so when we think about parenting, we think about, mom and dad together doing, we think about a coaching staff or a teaching, whatever it is, that we always think about, that leadership always thinks in the we, and that I have power to give away to cultivate a wider ownership to get the work done. And again, that's a little bit of the, the message that we're getting for the new administration is there's unity. We're going to do this as a team. how people, we've had on the stage different models over the years of how people act independently or versus build a team, and what's the impact on other people when you don't build a team and you act unilaterally. So that's a great, I think, diving into that, listening to the people before we move forward, building a team. And again, we could have talked about others, but we hope that you will walk away with this sense, and Brandon, jump in here, but it's like leadership matters. And God is a leader, and Jesus was the greatest leader. And all of us will never be fully like Jesus or fully like Nehemiah in every way, but we're part of a movement that demands that leadership that matters reflects the image of God and the priorities of God. And not all leaders are good leaders. And so as much as any time in the history of the world, we need people who have a conviction about this and will move out encouraged to do that. So thank you, Bob, for your words. Brandon?
Yeah. Well, I think Bob mentioned it as in passing as he was talking about his boss and up there, but in just, the underpinning thing that's coming from, especially the two things that we talked about, is that it's absolutely important and pivotal that a leader cultivate trust with the people that they're with, and they cannot listen. If you're not listening to anybody, how are you ever expected to cultivate trust? And then the next point, to build a team. If we're going to move somewhere, trust, I think, speaks to safety. It speaks to the ability for Bob to be able to say what he wants to say at the meeting and feel like she's not going to come down with a hammer, even though, she has said, I want your full voice. There's been a cultivated trust that says, well, yeah, whatever my full voice is accepted at this table and will be dealt with. And as we look at the new administration that's coming in, they will have to cultivate trust in order for anybody to follow them. And that'll be the first and foremost. It doesn't really matter what party they're a part of.
Right.
It's going to matter that we begin to cultivate trust so that they can, and part of that will be that they hear what the people are saying. They can build a team that accurately represents those that they're trying to serve. And so, yeah, thank you so much for the conversation on this by both of you. It's been enlightening and a good look at what leadership is from a biblical perspective. Many other aspects are needed as well, such as humility, grace, trust, as I've said, and they're woven into Nehemiah's life and his life with people and life with God. But I just kind of, before we end, are there any final thoughts for you, Bob, or for you, John, on this topic of leadership?
Brandon, such a good summary. One thing that I thought of as you said that was, when the full voice has been invited to the table, by my boss, for example, now, that does not mean she has forfeited her leadership. And I think that's where people get fearful of inviting people in. One of the things I've heard in the business community, all my business career, 28 years in for-profit world, was don't get too close to your people, because, you might need to can them someday. They're going to want more money, whatever. I'm like, and then I watch a guy like Pete Carroll with the Seahawks, and who I just am fascinated with, because here's a white 68-year-old man dealing with a primarily African-American culture of his athletes. And I'm telling you, I've watched him. He can tell you the guys that he cut 8 years ago who are no longer in the league, and he could describe all their kids, their wife's name. He cared deeply about the person. That did not change the fact that there's a performance level, that is a competition. It didn't forfeit that to care for the human being. And that's what I think Kendra does really well with me, is I'm totally cared for my voice, but she will override me in a moment. No problem, because that's her role. And I'm thankful for that. In fact, it almost empowers me to use my voice, because I know I'm not going to derail her making decisions that she sees best for the organization.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, that's good. John, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my final thought would be is that I think about my own story, what's been important, and what I think about going forward more generally is, I would say, make sure you're under good leadership. I mean, it's find people that you believe are good leaders and let them lead you and be a part of their team, and find a place, a laboratory, whether it's your home or your church or your workplace. And then secondly, I would just say is start small. Start where you are. Don't, I mean, in other words, don't pretend, well, someday I'm going to be a leader and it's this big title position. All of us are in places. So identify that place that you're in where you can start listening, where you can invite somebody to help you and to do something and lead out in some way and practice this. And you know, those who have been faithful in little will be then given more. And so I just think about the small places in my life, the interior work that develops. It carries forward into then more, you know, future places of leadership that might have more title, might not. So having a, you know, be under good leadership, and to have a place where you start right now and practice the things and let God work through that is maybe the two small steps I think we can all take to make this more real.
Yeah, thank you, John. I mean, an encouragement for those in in my generation. If there's anything we ever needed more, it's that of good leaders, and to speak towards good leadership, to talk it up, and to come against bad leadership, and to say that this is not okay anymore, and to set a higher standard. And so I encourage all those listening to take those steps, whatever it might be. Search out for good leadership. Make it a priority. This is something the world desperately needs. Well, we thank you all for joining us today. Bob, I thank you so much for having you on. It's been a pleasure to be here. And for all of those listening, just remember that John and I are, all of us, John, myself, and Bob, we're just trying to find our way in this story as we go. And so we're in the journey with you. Yep. Again, we thank you for joining us, and we'll catch up with you guys next time.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, John.